The large auditorium was completely silent, but not the kind of silence that comes with peace. It was a heavy, tired silence that hung in the air like thick smoke. It was late in the afternoon, the sun was already going down outside, and inside the building, the air felt stale. The bright spotlights on the stage were blazing hot, and they seemed to drain the energy out of everyone in the room. It was the final day of the big regional talent competition, and the excitement that usually fills these events was completely gone. At the long judging table sat two people who looked like they had aged 10 years in just a few hours. On the left was Mr. Vance, a senior judge known for being tough but fair. Today, however, he just looked defeated. His shoulders were slumped forward, and he was rubbing his temples with his fingers, trying to massage away a headache that had been building up since lunch. Next to him sat Ms. Lee, a celebrated music teacher who usually had a smile for everyone. Now, she was just staring blankly at the stack of papers in front of her, her pen tapping nervously against the desk. She had stopped writing notes hours ago because there was nothing left to say. They had been sitting there for hours, watching person after person walk onto the stage, hoping for a big break, only to fail in the worst ways possible. It wasn't just that people were bad, it was that they were unprepared. It was painful to watch. A young man earlier had tried to sing a high opera song but forgot the words and ended up just making strange noises into the microphone. Before that, a dance group had spent more time arguing with each other than dancing. The list of failures went on and on. The judges had come to find the next big star, but instead, they were watching a never-ending parade of disappointment. The audience, usually the heartbeat of the show, was dead. Rows upon rows of seats were filled with people who were checking their watches, looking at their phones, or just staring at the ceiling with bored expressions. The buzz of excitement from the morning had vanished. People were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, the plastic creaking under their weight. You could hear coughing, the shuffling of feet, and the occasional sigh of someone wishing they were somewhere else. The atmosphere was so thick with negativity that it felt hard to breathe. Mr. Vance leaned over toward Ms. Lee, keeping his voice low so the microphones wouldn't pick it up. He looked exhausted. "I don't think I can do this anymore," he whispered, shaking his head slowly. "There is nothing left here. We have seen everything there is to see, and it wasn't good enough." Ms. Lee let out a long, deep breath and looked at him with sad eyes. She knew exactly how he felt. "I know," she whispered back. "I was hoping that maybe, just maybe, someone would surprise us in the last hour. But I think we are just wasting time. I think I lost hope about 3 contestants ago." They both sat back in their chairs, feeling the weight of the day pressing down on them. It was a terrible feeling for judges who genuinely loved the arts. They wanted to find talent, they wanted to say yes to someone. But today, it seemed impossible. The standards were high, and nobody was meeting them. In fact, nobody was even coming close. It felt like the talent pool had dried up completely. The magic of the competition was gone, replaced by a grind that nobody was enjoying. The stage manager, a young man wearing a headset, walked onto the stage. He looked tired too, probably from dealing with nervous and upset contestants all day. He checked his clipboard and signaled to the sound booth. The giant speakers let out a screech of feedback that made everyone in the audience wince and cover their ears. Mr. Vance winced and closed his eyes for a moment, his patience hanging by a thread. It was just one more annoyance on top of a terrible day. "Ladies and gentlemen," the hostess' voice echoed through the hall. He tried to sound energetic, but you could tell he was reading from a script and just wanted to go home. "We have just a few more acts for you tonight. Please welcome our next contestant to the stage. The applause was weak. It was the kind of polite clapping people do when they don't really care but feel like they have to. It was scattered and quiet, dying out almost as soon as it started. The judges didn't even clap. They just sat there, arms crossed, waiting for the next wave of awkwardness to hit them. They were ready to hit their buzzers, ready to say no, ready to call it a night. In their minds, the show was already over. They were just going through the motions now, waiting for the clock to tick down so they could finally leave the building and forget about this long, disappointing day. The lights dimmed slightly, focusing on the center of the stage where the curtain was about to open. The air in the room felt heavy with skepticism. Everyone was expecting another disaster. Everyone was prepared to be bored. The judges exchanged a look that said, "Let's get this over with." They had no idea that their expectations were about to be shattered in a way they never saw coming. The hope was lost, the energy was gone, but the stage was set for a moment that would wake everyone up in seconds. The host's voice echoed through the quiet hall, trying to drum up some excitement for the next name on the list. And now, please welcome to the stage Leo. He is 8 years old. The silence that followed was different from the tired quiet before. It was a silence of confusion, mixed with a low wave of murmurs that rippled through the rows of seats. People looked at each other, raising their eyebrows. 8 years old on a stage this big, with professional judges watching, it seemed like a joke, or perhaps a mistake by the organizers. The heavy red curtains in the center of the stage slowly began to part. As they slid away, a small figure stepped out into the blinding white light. The first thing everyone noticed was just how tiny he looked. The stage was massive, designed for adults and full bands, and in the middle of it stood a little boy who looked like he had gotten lost on his way to school. He was wearing a formal black suit, but it was clearly too big for him. The jacket sleeves were a little too long, covering half of his hands, and his pants were bunching up slightly over his shiny black shoes. He looked like a child playing dress up in his father's clothes. In his hand, he dragged a heavy violin case. It was almost as tall as his chest, and the weight of it made him walk with a slight tilt to the left. The contrast was almost painful to see. The audience didn't know whether to laugh or to feel sorry for him. A soft, collective sound of awe swept through the crowd. It was the sound people make when they see a puppy trying to climb stairs. It wasn't a sound of respect, it was pity. They were already smiling, but not because they were expecting a show. They were smiling because they thought it was cute that he was trying so hard. Mr. Vance, the senior judge, didn't smile. He just let out a long, audible exhale and slumped further into his chair. He had seen this many times before. Parents bringing their kids on stage, forcing them to perform, thinking that being cute was enough to win a talent competition. He checked his watch again, counting down the minutes until he could leave. To him, this wasn't entertainment, it was just a waste of valuable time. He picked up his pen, tapping it impatiently on the desk, ready to write a quick no the second the act was over. Ms. Lee, sitting next to him, was a bit kinder in her expression, but her eyes betrayed her exhaustion. She watched the boy struggle to walk across the stage with his heavy instrument. She felt a pang of sympathy for him. The stage lights were terrifying for grown-ups, let alone a small child. She could see the fear in his body language. He wasn't walking with the confidence of a star, he was shuffling, his eyes darting around the huge, dark theater, looking for a familiar face but finding only a sea of strangers. Leo reached the center of the stage, right where the microphone stand was waiting. It was adjusted for an adult height, looming over him like a streetlight. He stood there for a moment, looking smaller and more fragile than ever. The audience quieted down, watching him fumble with the latch of his violin case. His little fingers struggled with the metal clasps. It was awkward. There was no grace in his movements, just the clumsy reality of a child handling a complex piece of equipment. The tension in the room was awkward. No one knew how to react. Should they clap? Should they wait? The judges sat stone-faced. Mr. Vance had already decided this was going to be a disaster. He leaned towards Ms. Lee again, keeping his voice low so the microphones wouldn't catch it. "Here we go," he muttered, his voice dripping with cynicism. "The cute kid segment. I give it 30 seconds before he starts crying or plays something completely wrong." Ms. Lee nodded slowly, though she looked uncomfortable. "Let's just be nice, Vance," she whispered back. "He's just a baby. Let him do his thing and we'll send him home gently." They both turned their attention back to the stage, their expressions showing that they had mentally checked out. They were just waiting for the inevitable squeak of a violin string that usually comes with beginners. Finally, Leo managed to undo the last latch on the case. He opened it and carefully lifted out the violin. It was a beautiful, glossy instrument, but it looked huge against his small neck. He placed the violin under his chin and tucked it into his shoulder. Then, he grabbed the bow. The audience watched with mild amusement, expecting a funny moment where he would drop it or hold it backwards. It felt like a scene from a movie where the clumsy kid tries to be cool and fails. The boy stood there, his feet apart, trying to find a stable stance. He looked terrified. The theater was so big, and he was so alone up there. The lights were bright, making it impossible for him to see the judges clearly. He took a deep, shaky breath that seemed to lift his entire small frame. Mr. Vance raised his hand slightly, his finger hovering over the buzzer, ready to stop the act the moment it became unbearable. The audience members leaned back in their seats, ready to clap politely just to be nice, preparing to say good job to a child who they thought was just out of his depth. Nobody in the room expected a miracle. In fact, nobody in the room expected anything other than a sweet, clumsy mess. The air was filled with low expectations and a sense of impatience. They wanted the cute kid to finish so the real entertainment could happen, or so they could just go home. The atmosphere was a strange mix of boredom and patronizing affection. Leo, standing in the center of the circle of light, was just a cute prop in their eyes. They had no idea that the boy holding the instrument was about to strip away their boredom in a matter of seconds. He tightened the bow hair one last time, his face suddenly changing from terrified to serious, catching the eye of Ms. Lee, who sat up just a fraction of an inch, sensing something was different. The silence in the auditorium stretched on, heavy and uncomfortable. On the stage, the little boy was having a hard time just keeping his instrument in the right position. The violin kept sliding down his shoulder because he was so small, and he had to keep lifting his chin to catch it again. It was a clumsy struggle, the kind that makes adults in the audience shift in their seats and look away because it feels awkward to watch. The tension wasn't about suspense, it was about pity. Everyone was waiting for the moment he would give up or start crying. Mr. Vance, the senior judge, couldn't take the suspense any longer. He tapped his pen on the desk, a sharp, rhythmic sound that echoed slightly in the quiet room. He leaned forward into his microphone, his voice sounding rough and impatient. "All right, young man," he said, not trying to hide his boredom. "Can you tell us what you are going to play for us today, and please, speak up so everyone can hear." Leo stepped closer to the microphone stand. He had to stand on his tiptoes and stretch his neck to reach the top of it. He looked even smaller next to the tall, black stand. He cleared his throat nervously, a small, squeaky sound that caused a few people in the front row to chuckle softly. When he spoke, his voice was thin and shaky, barely loud enough to reach the back of the room, but the microphone carried it clearly. "I am going to play Carmen, Fantasy," he whispered. The reaction from the judges was instant. Ms. Lee's head snapped up. Her eyes widened slightly behind her glasses, and she exchanged a quick, shocked look with Mr. Vance. Carmen Fantasy wasn't just a simple nursery rhyme or a popular pop song. It was one of the most difficult pieces in the classical violin repertoire. It was written by a virtuoso, a master, to show off extreme technical skill. It required speed, precision, and emotion that usually take decades to master. Professional musicians with years of training were terrified to play it in public because it was so unforgiving. One wrong note, one split-second hesitation, and the whole thing would fall apart. Mr. Vance let out a loud, sarcastic laugh. He couldn't help himself. He looked at the boy with a mix of disbelief and annoyance. "Carmen Fantasy," he repeated, raising an eyebrow so high it almost disappeared under his hairline. "You do know what that is, right? That is not Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. That is a beast of a song." He leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. "This is ridiculous," he muttered to Ms. Lee, though he didn't bother to keep his voice down. His parents must have forced him to say that. They probably told him it sounds impressive. There is no way an 8-year-old can pull that off. He looked at the stage manager, signaling that he wanted this over with quickly. "Okay, Leo. Give it your best shot. But please, try to keep it short." In the audience, the mood didn't change much. Most people didn't know that Carmen Fantasy was a hard piece. They just knew it sounded like a long name. They still saw a cute kid in a big suit. However, a few people who knew music sat up in their seats, whispering to their neighbors. "Is he serious?" a man in the third row asked. "That piece is insane. If he messes this up, it's going to be painful." Ms. Lee felt a knot form in her stomach. She didn't like being cynical, but she agreed with Mr. Vance. This felt like a setup for disaster. If the boy tried to play something so hard and failed, it would be humiliating for him. She wanted to tell him to stop, to play something easier, maybe a nice folk song. She tried to catch his eye to give him a reassuring smile, to tell him it was okay to just do his best, even if his best wasn't perfect. But Leo wasn't looking at the judges anymore. He wasn't looking at the audience, either. His gaze had dropped to the floor, and his face, which had been terrified and unsure a moment ago, suddenly changed. He took a step back, adjusting his feet so they were firmly planted on the floor. He wasn't the scared kid anymore. He was getting ready to work. He closed his eyes tight, shutting out the bright lights, the judges, the hundreds of people, and the giant, intimidating room. For a second, he looked like he was praying, or maybe just remembering the music in his head. The theater went quiet again. The air conditioning hummed in the background, a low, steady drone. Mr. Vance crossed his arms, his finger hovering over the red buzzer, ready to stop the performance the second the first squeak of a string ruined the song. Ms. Lee stopped tapping her pen, holding her breath without realizing it. Even the audience members who were checking their phones stopped what they were doing. There was something about the way the boy was standing so still and focused that made everyone pause. The cuteness was gone. The clumsiness was gone. In its place was a sudden, intense seriousness that nobody expected. Leo lifted the violin bow. He held it up in the air, pausing for just a heartbeat. The hand that had been fumbling with the case earlier was now steady. It was strange to see such a steady hand on such a small arm. He raised the bow to the strings, lining it up perfectly. Mr. Vance looked at Ms. Lee and rolled his eyes, mouthing the words, "Here we go." He was expecting a screeching disaster. He was expecting to have to comfort a crying child. He was ready to write cute but no on his scorecard and move on to the next person. The hope in the room was absolutely dead. The judges were just counting the seconds until they could leave. But then, in the split second before the bow touched the strings, the energy in the room shifted. It was like the air pressure changed. Ms. Lee felt a sudden chill run down her spine. The bored expression on her face melted away, replaced by a look of intense focus. She leaned forward, her elbows on the table, staring at the boy. She didn't know why, but her intuition as a musician was screaming at her that something was about to happen. The silence stretched out, tight and vibrating, waiting to be broken. The moment the horsehair bow made contact with the violin strings, the air in the room seemed to explode. It wasn't the weak, scratching sound that everyone had braced themselves for. It wasn't a wavering, high-pitched squeak that makes you cover your ears. Instead, a sound came out of that small instrument that was so rich, so deep, and so incredibly loud that it physically vibrated in the chests of the people sitting in the front row. Mr. Vance, who had just lifted his glass of water to his lips to take a sip while the boy failed, froze. The glass stayed in mid-air, hovering near his mouth, as his brain tried to process what his ears were hearing. The cynicism on his face didn't just fade, it was wiped away, replaced by a look of pure, unfiltered shock. The water in his glass rippled from the sound waves coming from the stage. He slowly lowered the glass, his eyes locking onto the small figure in the center of the light. He didn't blink. The red buzzer sat ignored in front of him, looking ridiculous now. Ms. Lee reacted even more viscerally. She had spent her entire life teaching music, listening to students practice scales and etudes for hours on end. She knew exactly how hard it was to make a violin sing. The sound that came out of Leo's instrument was the kind of tone that professional players chased for 30 years and never quite caught. It was warm, it was emotional, and it was perfectly in tune. Her hand flew to her chest, covering her heart, as if to protect herself from the sudden impact of the music. She leaned forward so far that she was almost halfway out of her chair. On the stage, Leo was gone. The shy, clumsy boy who couldn't reach the microphone had vanished. In his place was a musician in total command. He moved with the music. His body swayed back and forth, not because he was nervous, but because he was feeling every beat. His left hand, which had seemed so small and fragile when he was holding the case, was now a blur of motion. It raced up and down the neck of the violin with a speed that seemed impossible for human fingers, let alone an 8-year-old's. The piece, Carmen Fantasy, is based on a famous opera about passion, jealousy, and drama. It requires the player to act out these emotions with the violin. Leo wasn't just playing the notes, he was attacking them. In the fast sections, the music was like a storm, angry and fierce. He moved the bow so fast across the strings that it looked like it might catch fire from the friction. The sound was sharp and cutting, piercing through the heavy atmosphere of the auditorium and waking everyone up. The audience, who had been checking their phones and looking at their shoes only moments before, was now paralyzed. You couldn't hear a single cough or a whisper. The man in the third row who had whispered that it would be painful was now staring with his mouth slightly open. The couple in the back who were planning their dinner stopped talking. Hundreds of people were pulled into the same current, staring at the stage, united by disbelief. It wasn't just that the boy was good, it was that he was playing with a level of maturity and power that defied logic. As the music shifted into a slower, more melodic section, the room seemed to dim, even though the lights stayed the same. The notes were hauntingly beautiful. They hung in the air like smoke. Leo's face, illuminated by the spotlight, was intense. His eyes were squeezed shut, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. Sweat was beginning to form on his forehead, glistening in the bright light. He was working incredibly hard. You could see the muscles in his jaw tighten as he poured every ounce of his energy into the instrument. He was fighting a war with the music, and he was winning. Mr. Vance felt a chill run down his spine. He looked over at Ms. Lee, wanting to confirm that he wasn't dreaming. Ms. Lee wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were fixed on Leo's left hand, watching the intonation. She had a look on her face that Mr. Vance had never seen before. It was a mix of fear and reverence. She looked terrified that he might miss a note, but she also looked like she was witnessing a miracle. The judges had seen thousands of acts in their careers, but this was different. This was a lightning strike. The tempo of the music began to speed up again, accelerating toward the climax. The violinist was now stamping his foot on the floor in time with the rhythm, something that is often discouraged in classical training because it shows loss of control, but in Leo's case, it showed pure, wild intensity. He was driving the music forward. The sound grew louder and louder, filling every corner of the massive hall. The vibrations shook the dust off the rafters. People in the audience began to stand up, one by one, without even realizing they were doing it. They couldn't sit still. The energy was too strong. It was like sitting on the edge of a cliff. The music was rushing toward them, demanding their attention, refusing to be ignored. The cynical barrier that the judges and the crowd had built up over the long day was completely smashed. The boredom was gone. The tiredness was forgotten. There was only the sound of the violin, screaming and crying and singing all at once. Leo hit the final, impossibly fast run of notes. His bow arm was a piston, moving with mechanical precision but human soul. The last note was a high, piercing C that he held out, letting it ring and ring, filling the silence like a laser beam. As the sound faded, he didn't relax. He froze in the final pose, his chest heaving, the bow still pointing toward the ceiling. He held the pose, waiting for the echo to die completely. The final seconds of the performance hung in the air, thick with the aftermath of the storm. No one moved. No one breathed. The transformation was complete. The boy who had been pitted was now the master of the room. The final note of the violin hung in the air, vibrating against the walls of the massive auditorium like a ghost. It was a sharp, perfect high C that seemed to suspend time itself. For 3, maybe 4 seconds, nobody moved. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm breaks. Mr. Vance was still leaning halfway out of his chair, his hand frozen in mid-air. Ms. Lee had both hands over her mouth now, her eyes wide and glassy with tears. The audience, hundreds of people, sat as if they had been turned to stone. The contrast was shocking. Just moments ago, they were bored and checking their watches. Now, they were afraid to even breathe, terrified that if they made a sound, the magic would pop like a soap bubble. Then, the dam broke. It started as a single clap from the back of the room, followed instantly by a roar that seemed to shake the foundation of the building. It wasn't just polite applause, it was a deafening wave of noise that rolled over the stage like a physical force. People jumped to their feet so quickly that the chairs banged against the floor. The sound was a mixture of cheering, whistling, and shouting. A man in the front row was wiping his eyes with a handkerchief. A group of teenagers were screaming "Go!" at the top of their lungs. The energy that had been dead for hours suddenly came alive, crackling and electric, more intense than anything the judges had felt all day. On the stage, Leo seemed to snap out of a deep trance. The ferocious musician who had been attacking the violin vanished, replaced instantly by the small, tired boy in the oversized suit. He lowered his bow, his shoulders slumping forward as the adrenaline left his body. He looked down at his shoes, looking confused by the noise. He reached up and wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve, a simple, childish gesture that made the crowd love him even more. He didn't take a bow like a star, he just stood there, looking shy and overwhelmed, clutching his violin to his chest like a shield. Mr. Vance slowly sat back in his chair, but he didn't relax. He looked at his buzzer, the red button that he had been ready to press just minutes before, and let out a short, incredulous laugh. He shook his head in disbelief. "Did we just see what I think we saw?" he shouted over the noise to Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee nodded vigorously, finally lowering her hands. She was smiling so broadly it looked like her face might hurt. "We saw lightning in a bottle, Vance." That was impossible. She had to wipe a tear from her cheek, ruining her makeup, but she didn't care. "I have been teaching for 30 years, and I have never seen a child with that kind of passion. That wasn't a trick. That was real." The applause went on for so long that the host had to come back onto the stage just to quiet the crowd down. He walked to the center, looking dazed himself, and put a hand on Leo's small shoulder. "Ladies and gentlemen, please. Give him a chance to breathe," he yelled into the microphone, laughing. The noise died down slightly, turning into a rhythmic clapping that showed no signs of stopping. Mr. Vance grabbed his microphone and leaned in. His expression was completely different now. The cynicism, the tiredness, the "I want to go home" attitude, it was all gone. He looked like a man who had just witnessed a miracle. He waited for the room to get quiet, staring directly at the boy. "Leo," Mr. Vance said, his voice serious and rough with emotion. "I was ready to leave. I was ready to go home and tell everyone that there is no talent left in the city. I was wrong." He paused, looking down at his notes, then crumpled them up and threw them aside. The audience cheered at this gesture. "I have judged professionals, adults who have played in orchestras for 20 years, who cannot play that piece the way you just played it. You didn't just hit the notes, you told us a story. You made us feel something. I am lost for words." Ms. Lee took her microphone next. She took a deep breath to steady her voice. "Sweetheart," she said, looking at Leo with warm, motherly eyes. "That was one of the hardest pieces ever written for the violin. It requires strength, speed, and soul. Most people are too scared to even try it. You didn't just try it, you conquered it. You have a gift, a truly rare and beautiful gift. Please, never stop playing." The mention of "never stop playing" seemed to reach Leo. He finally looked up from his shoes and looked at the judges. A small, shy smile spread across his face. It wasn't the confident grin of a show-off, it was the genuine smile of a child who was just happy that people understood him. He bowed deeply, almost tipping over, which made everyone laugh and cheer even louder. The atmosphere in the auditorium had transformed completely. The heaviness was gone, replaced by a feeling of lightness and hope. The people in the audience were no longer strangers checking their phones, they were a community brought together by a shared moment of awe. They were talking to each other, excitedly pointing at the stage, reliving the moments of the performance. The fatigue of the long day had been washed away by the energy of one small boy. Mr. Vance turned to the camera, his face breaking into a rare, genuine smile. "And that, ladies and gentlemen," he said into the microphone, "is why we sit through all the bad acts. That is why we stay until the very end. Because sometimes, just when you think all hope is lost, an 8-year-old prodigy comes along and reminds you why you fell in love with music in the first place." The noise rose up again as Leo walked off the stage, dragging his heavy case, but this time he walked a little taller. The judges stood up and joined the applause, clapping until their hands stung. As Leo disappeared behind the curtains, the lights in the theater seemed to shine a little brighter. The day had been saved. The judges had found their star, and the audience had witnessed something they would talk about for years to come. The hopelessness had vanished, defeated in seconds by a little boy with a violin.